and they'll be talking about their projects. And we're going to split it into about 20 minutes each. So we'll have Alex Garlick speak first, and then there'll be some time for questions before we move on to the next presenter. So Alex Garlick is an assistant professor of political science at the University of Vermont, and his research focuses on the legislative process across state legislatures. So I will turn it over to you, Alex.
Great. Thank you so much, Ben. I am going to share my presentation here. All right, so my name is Alex Garlick. I'm an assistant professor here at the University of Vermont, and I'm also going to be talking today about work I did as a PhD student at University of Pennsylvania, and then as an assistant professor at the College of New Jersey, where I had a number of student RAs working with me with a large amount of open states data. And I want to stress that I don't consider myself to be a particularly senior academic. But that being said, where I want to start my talk today is what the dark ages used to be like for state politics researchers like myself before open states and other websites. So those of us that work on state politics are a little different than people that work on Congress. So Congress, as you know, a lot of attention, a lot of capacity. They have a single website that is pretty reliable for everything that you would need about Congress. Obviously, nothing of the sort existed at the state level. And a lot of more senior faculty than me used to travel to the state archives. This is a picture of the legislative histories of California, and like literally copy these things down by hand, or the Book of the States. And this was how research was done. So it was extremely resource intensive because you had to travel and you had to collect data by hand. Or even worse, you had to use LexisNexis. And I say that as someone that has published some of my best research using LexisNexis data, but those of you familiar with that service, it's proprietary, and they change the system a lot. They particularly are not fond of people scraping data the way that I have been known to. And we really, like, even though we had state legislatures publishing data, we really had no way to work with it. So Open States comes in and really offers a lot to researchers like myself. So I was a PhD student about 2013, 2014, when the Open States front page looked like this. And I really want to just highlight what it is about the project that has stood out and made it usable for people like me. This has become a somewhat crowded space, as there's a few different organizations that have taken on this task of digitizing information available on the internet. Legiscan, as I mentioned, LexisNexis, other websites. But what really has made it usable for researchers is a few things. The first is the bulk downloads of CSVs. And I know the field has moved towards more dynamic sharing of data, particularly through APIs, but that data that comes down and stays the same and that different people can reproduce and replicate is really helpful for researchers. The other thing that really has helped with Open States, and one reason I particularly liked it more than Legiscan and why I have used it for many years, is what I call the 360-degree view of not just pulling the legislative histories, but also detail on legislators, roll call votes, the different types of votes, the policy areas. And some of this, I think, is as simple as pulling off of the state legislative websites. A lot of this, however, is what coders have added in, and that has really done a lot. I will say, as an applied researcher, that the data that comes out of those bulk data sets or off the API, it's not really usually baked enough for publication. Usually it requires some additional coding or whatnot, but in my experience, Open States has been among the very best at producing that raw output as quickly as possible. So in terms of standardization, I've done a lot of work. One particular project I want to highlight today is some work I did with the TCNJ students I was just mentioning. And what we tried to do is we took what Open States calls built actions. And we tried to standardize them. I'm sorry, I'm from Boston. Sometimes I have that accent. So we tried to standardize them into a 90-point scale here of how far bills get. And this might seem obvious that you would be able to tell if a bill has passed one chamber, what I'm calling 38 here, passed two chambers or signed into law. But in my experience, this is a lot harder to deduce than you would think, particularly in the projects I'm working on recently, where we're accumulating hundreds of thousands of these bills. These small differences really matter a great deal. So I had students, writing these kind of code books, for lack of a better term, to try to standardize the states. And we tried to fit as many states as we could into this scale here. And they did some really interesting work. For example, I took this off a poster that some of my undergrads presented. So this was not really even research that I did all the way, but it really shows how a bill is not just a bill in every state. And what I mean by that is, in some states like Colorado, where there's rules where any bill that gets introduced gets consideration from the floor, or at least a committee vote, really makes those bills likely to pass. And this whole issue of what I'm calling here calendar control, this is essentially what the Kevin McCarthy fight before the U.S. House of Representatives last week boiled down to, is how much and how tight of a control over the agenda does the leader have. And so in states like Colorado, where they don't have that control, not nearly every, but the modal bill certainly is passed into law. And this is very different than most states. If you look in the upper right-hand quadrant here, I don't know if my cursor's on screen, but states that do not have introduction limits on how many bills each individual legislator can produce, and where the majority party controls the committee process and the floor, the modal bill there fails, and it just introduced and it dies. And so what this means is that bills can have a totally different purpose in Colorado than they do in, I don't know what's a regular state, Wisconsin. You get things like messaging legislation of bills that are introduced just to make a point, or perhaps make the minority party look bad, etc. And you really need a 50-state view that Open States provides to get this kind of a view of the legislative process. And the other thing that I think has been really helpful with the Open States data is what I call like interoperability. The ability to take these data and pair them up with some other type of data to ask a research question. So in this case, in using academic terms, where I was talking about independent and dependent variables, and the dependent variable is usually that outcome measure that people are interested in. So on the last slide, the outcome there was bill passage, and or even just bill passage from the first chamber. And what we did here is we paired up those how far individual bills got with lobbying data, and how many businesses are lobbying on bills. And again, this is where the 360 view of the Open States data becomes really useful, because it's not enough to just know how far bills get, but also who introduces the bill, what party are they from, etc. And when you add that together, we can see there's a pretty significant difference in how Republican-oriented, Republican-controlled chambers, which are in red here, and democratically controlled chambers, which are in blue here, operate. And in Republican chambers, bills are more likely to fail at the first stage of the process, at the committee process. And going back to the implication from the last slide, that's because the majority party has control over what gets a final vote. And when more businesses lobby in Republican chambers, they tend to suppress consideration, and bills tend to fail earlier. This is not necessarily the case in democratically controlled chambers, where we don't see the same strong relationship between business lobbying and bills dying. This is not to say that Democratic controlled chambers are universally hostile to business interests, but we don't see as efficient agenda control in the Democratic controlled legislatures as we do in the Republican ones. And so, again, this is the type of analysis that requires the wide breadth of data that Open States has provided. From some of my own published work, this was something I originally did in my dissertation. Could also talk about some really, or I'd say topical issues, which is polarization. What are the issues that really divide the parties? And this is something that I found specifically in Open States data, with Open States' ability to classify what the policy area of certain bills was. And this was almost 8 or 10 years ago at this point. So I think the state of the art has probably changed a bit. But at the time, Open States was one of the only services that was coding the legislation by its policy area. And it wasn't all 50 states, but it was like 30-something states. And what I did with that is I paired that up, and I also coded all of the roll calls by Democrat and Republican to try to find what the issues were that were dividing the party. We call party difference on issues where the parties are voting in different directions. And for this number of years here, it should be a big surprise that the most divisive issues were abortion and immigration and gun control and elections. That hasn't really changed that much in the past 10 years. Those are still the issues that divide. And it took kind of the dynamic data that we have from Open States to be able to deduce this. This is another case too, where I would call the data interoperable because I paired it up with my own data I had collected on the interest group community in each of these states, trying to see what were the issues that are being lobbied on nationally. So like what you see there with abortion is that's a very national issue where the same interest groups are lobbying at the state level and the national level, versus more local issues like municipal issues. They don't have that same kind of national component to them, and they also tend to be less polarized, which gives us kind of an insight on the political context of these states as well. And so again, this was a project that at the time was only possible through Open States, and which really worked out well for me. All right, so where to go in the future? I think there's a few things to keep in mind. First is that this is a particularly interesting time to be working on state legislatures. I'm kind of always making the case that state legislatures are relevant, especially for policy-wise, but they're not always as kind of like front page newsworthy as they've been in 2022 and will be in 2023. And this is in large part just due to some national political factors. For example, the SCOTUS decision of Dobbs versus Jackson, by making abortion, limiting abortion before 24 weeks, as Roe versus Wade had, by making that a state level issue, it's really shifting the locus of policymaking power over abortion to the states. And I've seen a lot of attention from journalists, from the public, on how the state legislatures are making those decisions right now. And I think, to the extent we can have the best data available, it's really going to help data analysts and journalists alike understand what's going on there. And just in general, going back to last slide, talk about how controversial elections have been. The SCOTUS consideration of this independent state legislature theory, where we could potentially remake the Electoral College, is again, we're going to be looking at the states as a real battleground for the 2024 election before it even starts. I do have a couple not requests, but suggestions for people thinking about what to do going forward with the data that Open States provides and can fashion. And the first thing I'd say is it's great to look forward and to be up to date, APIs and whatnot. And I know that's often the commercial application of these data, and I want to stress that. But don't be afraid to look back and really create a stable archive of what's happened in the past. For applied researchers like myself, things move really slowly. That paper I was just showing you, the data ended in 2014. I wrote that paper in 2015. it got into the publication process for a couple of years and eventually came out in 2017. So, stability and reliability is something that we really cherish. And the more stable and the further back data goes, the more likely it is to be of use of researchers. And in many ways can help, data people leave a larger imprint with their work if our historians and analysts like myself can work with it. Another thing to think about going forward is how to make the data more interoperable with other data sources. So for instance, the National Institute for Money and State Politics has really good database of lobbying activity and financial expenditures. And whenever that can become more interoperable, whether using its state legislators as a unit of analysis or topic areas or policies like I was talking about, that can be super useful. There's a similar project at the national level called LobbyView by Professor In-Sung Kim at MIT that has organized the congressional data, but honestly, some of the best stuff is at the state level. And lobbying in particular has been overlooked, and to the extent that open states could incorporate in that'd be super useful. I've also seen good data, good projects on like the revolving door and how legislators leave office. And so people have started to use LinkedIn data or FEC campaign data. The interoperability is just always something that is a huge value. And then the last thing I'd say is accessibility is appreciated. So I am not as tech savvy as the people on this call, but I know how to use Stata and R to fashion CSVs into research. And in particular, I spent a lot of time teaching undergrad students who are not computer science majors or who do not have coding experience how to do the same. So to the extent that the data can be as accessible as possible, and I love CSV downloads that students that don't even know what Stata or R is can look at it in Excel, that can be a huge value add and really a good way to get people involved and interested in this data. So those are my thoughts, and I'd be happy to answer any questions people have or take comments either in the chat here or over email. So thank you for this opportunity to talk to this audience, and I'm really interested to hear from people.
Thank you so much, Alex, for sharing your research. It's really fascinating kind of analysis that you're doing. And yeah, we'd like to open it up if anyone has any questions. Now would be the time to ask.
I had a quick question. This is Jeff Pierce. What did calendar no mean in the slide, Alex, that you were showing with the four, options there? You had calendar control, no, because that's the one where more legislation passed than didn't. Where I was wondering what that meant.
Yeah, it's a great question. So a calendar control means that the majority party does not have a strong grip over what gets to the floor. And so technically, the U.S. Congress, with the concessions that Kevin McCarthy made, was supposed to move in that direction. So we'll see what happens over the next 2 years. But that means that minority party legislators would have the ability to get bills through and get a final vote on them for final passage.
So as a political science person, then does that imply that where there's no control, there's more incentive for bipartisanship in the states? Yeah.
Okay. And it's not to talk too much about the U.S. House, but many of the reforms last week that were extracted were actually the kind of things that people like me had been calling for, which is to kind of open up the process and to let the individual rank and file members amend and propose legislation. And that has not been the case in recent years, and the minority party getting that chance is interesting, I would say. I also just want to quickly address Spencer's question from the chat about what sort of lobbying data is out there. So the number one source of lobbying data, Spencer, is disclosure reports, where individual lobbyists have to register every quarter or annually and say who their client is and how much money they've made. So my name's Alex Garlick. I work for IBM and I make whatever in the quarter or the year. And so we have those both at the state and federal level. The nice thing about some states is they have bill level lobbying reports. So Wisconsin, you have to say, I'm a lobbyist for IBM and I oppose AB1, AB2. And so you can actually look at the groups that are on each individual bill and what position they're taking on those bills. And so it's really like the cutting edge of lobbying research right now is on those bill level lobbying data, but they're only available in about 5 states. I'll put some links in the chat after my session here, Spencer, to share that data. This is my literal passion and day job. Loving data and try and patch it down. Yes, Ed.
Yeah, did you do anything with modeling of the cases where the interactions between the houses don't follow, the chambers don't follow the usual case? So, for instance, a couple of competing bills that need to be merged, or an amendment arises in the second chamber and it has to get thrown back, and that kind of thing.
Yeah, so that's the project that I actually worked on most of this data for, is trying to understand how the chambers interact in different states. And what we found initially is that a lot of it depends on how professionalized the state is. So in a state like Illinois, Chicago, California, Massachusetts, where you have a legislature, it's a full-time job and everything, you have a lot of these interactions between the chambers as they resolve their differences, like a conference committee. In the less professionalized states like Utah, what we're finding is that the chambers tend to just rubber stamp what the other chamber is doing. So it's almost like they split the agenda up and trust each other to work on it. And so it appears to be more efficient in practice that the chambers are just rubber stamping each other. But it kind of defeats the whole purpose of having a second chamber if there's no, going back to James Madison, the whole point of the two chambers is to, the House heats up and the Senate's supposed to be the cooling saucer to make better decisions or something. But we're finding there's not as much of that interaction across all 50 states. And so we're trying to determine why that's happening. And that's what the current project is about.
Thanks much.
My pleasure.
Great. Well, it looks like the stack is clear and we don't have any more questions, but thank you so much again, Alex, for sharing your research. It's really fascinating to hear what you're up to.
Great. Very nice to meet you, Ben, and best of luck to everyone with the rest of the conference.
Thank you. All right. So our next speaker is Ramon Perez from votingrightsbrigade.org. And he will be talking about data integration with the Digital Democracy Project. So I'll turn it over.
Thank you. Thank you, Ben. I appreciate it. So I'm going to do this in 4 parts. I'm going to first show a 2-minute video on the Digital Democracy Project, just to try to give an introduction of what it is. And then I'm going to show our mobile app experience and how we're providing open states data to our users. Then I'm going to show you our website and how we're using open states data for mapping purposes. And then I'm going to give you a sneak peek at a feature that we're about to roll out where we intend to use open states, the GQL API for vote records, live vote records. So I'm going to hope my hotel Wi-Fi bears with me during this process. So I'm going to shut off my camera just to save some bandwidth, and let me jump into our to the overview video. let me know if you can't hear this, so.
We aren't able to hear it.
You said yes or no?
No, you may need to share your audio with us.
I know there's a Zoom option. Come on, Zoom. Here we go, share computer sound, okay. Try this again.
Ever wish you could tell your legislators exactly how to vote? Well, now you can. And it's right in the palm of your hands. Introducing the Digital Democracy Project, a mobile voting app and online tracking system, connecting you to the process, giving you the power. You vote on pending bills, on issues that affect us all, every day, telling legislators how you want them to vote. There's no party politics, no big money, and no special interests. We only compare what voters want to what legislators actually deliver, and everybody can see it. Your representatives, the media, everybody, all from your phone. Plus, it's absolutely free. It's as easy as 1, 2, 3. You vote on the same bills as your representatives. We track it online in real time, a running tally. Then we take score. We add up every vote on every issue and we post it. You can see if they have voted with or against the majority. And come election time, now you know the score. It's powered by blockchain technology, keeping you secure. And with ID verification, it guarantees that all votes are real votes by real human voters. And don't worry, we never store, share, or monetize your data. And we never will. We're just putting the power where it belongs, right in your hands. So join us. We have the technology. You have the power. The Digital Democracy Project. This is what democracy looks like.
Okay, so hopefully everybody could hear that okay. Let me see if I can transition into the app itself and try to share that. So I'm going to give a quick introduction to our partner is Votes. Votes is a Boston-based startup company that make election software for mobile voting, and they're in a variety of different states. And we are, as you can see from the video, we have a slightly, we're obviously not an elections board. We're not running a state election, but we are taking advantage of all the technological innovations that they've introduced for the Digital Democracy Project. So we can account for the fact that every voter who gets on here, we verify them against the voter file. We've launched this in Florida, by the way. So that's the first state that we're active in. We went live back in October. So we've been up for about 3 months now. So whenever a new voter comes in, we can verify them against the voter file, and then we can do the selfie scan and photo ID match to make sure that that's a real person and not some hacker or bot or whatever the case. So at that point, we know that that's a US citizen who's registered to vote in the state of Florida, and we can trust that it's a real human being. So at that point, then they can see what we load here. All of this actually comes from what we have in open states. So I could show you a bunch of the 2022 bills, but actually I want to zoom in on the December special session, which was just run here in Florida. It focused on property insurance. It's been a big issue because of all of the hurricanes we've had. Property insurance costs are very, very high. So let me show you what the user would see here. You get questions about the bills that are working their way through the legislature, and we allow them to vote on these bills, and we provide them the information from open states to give them additional context. So that's directly in the app experience, right? So you've got the abstract, you can see who's the co-sponsors, you can see the life cycle of the bill. everything that you guys are fully aware of. And we've had really good feedback from users on how helpful this is to get a sense of appropriations or the bipartisanship of a bill, or just, you know, how it's moved through the process. We also provide a debate platform. You guys might already know these guys, another organization named Kialo, but we take some of the information from open states and we put it into this debate platform, and then we allow users to expand on that, to talk about the pros and cons of each of those bills, so they can discuss if it's a positive or negative for the state, and ultimately how they want to vote on it. Then at that point, voters can cast a ballot. And then I'm going to actually show you what they see. They get instant results. This is all based on Hyperledger technology. It's used a blockchain backend to record votes. And so all votes can be independently audited, but you get instantaneous results on what this is showing you is, you know, how all voters voted on each of these particular bills. But then what I want to show you as I transition from mobile app to website, give me one moment. Okay, so then because all voters are verified against the voter file, we actually have precinct level data. So we can break down vote records for each of these bills. Hopefully you can see my screen. I'm in Chrome. Anybody can go to digitaldemocracyproject.org and see this right now. This is live. And the vote results from the blockchain are then consumed and put into a map. We use OpenStates again for the mapping project. So in here, then you get a chance to see the vote breakdown for the bill by state and by district. And the concept here is that I'll show you some of the 2022 general election or general legislature bills, for example. We want a legislator to be able to see what his or her district is telling him or her to do. So it's useful to know what people across the state want, but it's really what a legislator cares about is, am I going to get reelected or not? So am I going to do what the voters in my district are telling me to do? Now, obviously, we just launched this thing, so we've only gotten a couple of hundred voters registered so far. We need to be in the, probably in the millions before we're really talking about a lot of statistical power. But that's the premise here, is that we have enough to tell a legislator that the data sends a strong signal about what the voters want. Okay, so now let me jump over to Zoom thing. You are in my way. How do I get this out of the way? There we go. Pull that down. Okay. So then the next major feature that we're going to roll out is the ability to actually track accountability for those particular representatives. So we've already said we gave the voters, they're all fully verified. We gave them the right to vote on each of these bills. We then show on the map to the legislators and to the general public and to the journalists and the media and whoever what their voters wanted for every single bill. And we did it by House and by Senate, State House and State Senate. Then what we want to do is we want to say, okay, well, now how did those representatives from those same districts actually vote on each of those bills? And again, this heavily relies on OpenStates. This is the API v3. So this is using the graph query language that's provided in the OpenStates database to allow us to know every single representative and how they voted on every single bill, which is brilliant, because then what we can do is we can provide each one of these scorecards here, where we say this representative, here was the name of the bill. This is what the voters wanted. This is how they voted in the app. They said they wanted, they were in favor of it or they were against it. And then their representative either did what they wanted or did the opposite of what they wanted. And then they get a score where did they match their district in that bill? And then can we weigh them across the entire year, for example, the whole session year? So you might have a general session and then you might have special sessions, but we do a breakdown by year. So then you can sort of rack and stack every representative in the state to try to decide who's the best at representing his or her district amongst all the 120 House members and 40 state Senate members. And as you can see, I think Open States is tightly integrated into everything we've done. So it's been a great partnership. I've really enjoyed working with Jesse and the team. And what's been nice is sort of the responsiveness of, whenever we have particular needs or need support, we reach out on Slack and we've been supported. And so it's been a great partnership so far. So let me stop there and open it up to questions. I'm amazed that my Wi-Fi didn't drop out. Hopefully not, unless you haven't heard anything for the last 10 minutes and I'm just coming back on. I see a bunch in the chat. Ben, are you QCing the?
So quick
Okay.
question.
Yes.
Yeah, the potential for many thousands of voters to sign up for this thing, or millions.
Right.
It costs money to verify the IDs. How do you handle that? Do they have to buy in, or do they, for $5, whatever it is, or what?
No, we are a nonprofit organization. We are funded by donations from the public and by granting organizations. So we try to think of ourselves like a Wikipedia type of project where we want, yes, millions of voters to be in here and telling their legislators how to vote. And we try to keep voter verification as automated as possible. So a lot of that is, having good data pipelines and having good the facial scanning. It's pretty good facial ID automation, but when it fails, it goes to a human queue. So that's kind of how we manage that. And we try to get that performance as high as possible to try to avoid a lot of workflow around that. But yeah, tech support, onboarding people, that's an area where trying to keep that as seamless as possible where the technology can be as user-friendly as possible so that we don't have to have a lot of manual entry in getting people onto the app.
I guess next question, a lot of legislation is many hundreds of pages. How do you simplify that into a couple of paragraphs? Yeah,
exactly. So I've hired a legislative coordinator who actually has a lot of experience in Tallahassee and to read the bills and summarize them as quickly as we can. We do use some abstract data that Open States is gleaning from the bills themselves. We then provide that into that Kialo debate platform, and then we allow some crowdsourcing to grapple onto that and expand upon it, adding pros and cons. So because I, as you can imagine, yes, reading through loads and loads of bills is a lot of work. We are looking at potentially using ChatGPT, or other AI tools to rapidly summarize legislation and give us a summary that we can load into Kialo. And then again, we're going to rely on our community to try to fill in the gaps and really pull the legislation apart and try to help explain it to one another so they can make the most informed decisions.
A question. Do you intend to provide a way for the politicians themselves to chime in on the debate? Like, here's the reasons why I voted against the,
I would really like that. Yeah, I would like, there's another nonprofit out there that actually has a mobile app where they allow politicians to kind of upload videos and, but I could see some mechanism for that some point down in the future. If there's a way for a politician to say, hey, you're reading the bill, but just so you know, there's this other negotiation that happened in the amendments process, and this is why the bill ended up the way it did, and give a little bit more context behind the scenes into this process. I think that would be incredibly valuable.
Likewise, 501c4s would want to chime in. Like, there's a lot of times when like the Clean Air Act is not really about clean air, it was about it lowered the standards. So if you can let 501c4s in, that'd be awesome too.
Right, or the Inflation Reduction Act or whatever, right? The naming. Well, and also some of these big omnibus bills are so many different topics. It's more common at the state level, I think, to have single topic bills. Once we start trying to do this for the federal level, it's you know, level of complexity goes up, I think. We do have the data capability to do this for US House and Senate. But we would have to, you know, put in the effort to put that onto the roadmap. I think there was a question in the chat. Was it Akana asked, how do they know what voters wanted? And so we, right, exactly. So the idea is we get is, if you think about this as almost like polling on steroids, where the mobile technology is making the cost of running a poll super, super cheap. Because polling, if you look at it right now, you got to call 10,000 phones to try to get 500 people to pick up and ask them questions for about 10 to 15 minutes and hope they don't hang up on you at some point in that process. But then of those 500 who successfully get through, you know, you got to do some statistical alchemy to determine, are they likely voters? Is it a representative sample, et cetera? We're sort of trying to flip that on its head and say, well, what if we could just ask everybody? What if it was so cheap to get to enroll people that you could have millions of people participate constantly, and they can engage on whatever topic they're interested in. So you don't have to go to them and interrupt their day and ask them about a topic they're hearing about for the first time. Instead, they can relax, think about it, do it on their own time. Maybe they care about environmental policy. Maybe they care about healthcare. Maybe they care about taxation, and then they can jump in and vote on those particular bills where they have a high interest and ignore the rest or abstain on the others. And so that's our goal, is that we believe that there's the real economy of scale here. And also that voters don't really fit neatly into a left or right spectrum. Most people actually fall somewhere along, you know, in the middle. They take a little bit of the ideas from the Democrats, they take a little bit of ideas from the Republicans, they take a little bit from third parties to form their worldview. They don't necessarily always line up on one or the other. And that's, even at a small scale, even with a couple of hundred voters, we can kind of see some of those patterns emerging already. We can't see how individuals voters voted because that's protected and encrypted, but we can just see sort of just from the vote aggregates that it doesn't really follow a political affiliation in the way that you would kind of expect. So I'm most excited about that. I'm most excited about, if I think about a lot of the reasons why I got into this project in the beginning, it was because of hyperpolarization and just how it tears apart my family and other people's over this tribalism that we have. When if you actually ask voters what they want in the app, in the way that we're doing it, you find that people are actually quite moderate and nuanced in their points of view. So that was a long-winded way of not answering your question, Akana. So if you have a follow-up, drop it in the chat and I'll see if I can do a better job.
So is this,
go ahead.
Is this like a populist project then?
I don't know if I'd call it that. I mean, ultimately it is a technology project. We are strictly nonpartisan. We do not see ourselves, we by design, this is a public good. I come back to Wikipedia, right? It's crowdsourced. It's a public service. It's available to everybody for free. It's supported by donations. It does not have a political affiliation. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's how we just, and if you look at our board of directors, we were intentional about the members of our board coming from all political affiliations. So we've had some Bush appointees, we've had some DeSantis appointees, we've had some, we had one of the women on our board was a Democratic nominee for governor of the state of Massachusetts, ran against Mitt Romney. We have the former vice chair of the Libertarian Party of Florida on our board. So we kind of, and several independents. So we really run the board is varied. That's intentional. I don't want to think any kind of party, just want to provide a service, can make decisions for themselves. There's a question from David. What is the relationship with votes? So votes really provides the technology that we're using. Votes is they've been around since about 2015 or 16 now. So they're a startup, they're a venture funded startup and a for-profit company. They sell their software to states and municipalities. They just ran municipal elections in Ontario, Canada, or in Canada, I think, and a couple of other places. We just lost me. Okay. Am I back? Okay, thanks, Ben. So they sell this technology to a state board of elections that is running a real certified election and is allowing certain people, mostly military overseas voters or voter will get polls are given the opportunity to vote from a mobile phone. So votes has already gone through all the cybersecurity stuff, all of the voter verification stuff, all the auditability stuff, to get selected by several states to do that job. So we're sort of riding on the back of a lot of the major made in the technology side. As I mentioned, it uses Hyperledger. It is a decentralized system by design. We can, if for those of you who care about Web3 stuff, we can talk about that separately if you like, or I can point you to some documentation about how that works. But that gives you a lot of fantastic features, meaning in the sense of auditability, that it's basically impossible to hack, that there's device level encryption, there's mobile authentication and biometrics. So there's a lot that makes this a secure process that allows us to trust the results.
Well, thank you, Ramon, for sharing the projects that you're working on. This is just an amazing use of open states data. Thank you again.
Well, thank you guys, because it wouldn't be possible without your work. I really appreciate it.
All right, so we're going to move on to our next speaker, Josh Mattingly. And Josh is the founder of Open Lake Consulting, a Chicago-based firm dedicated to providing data services to nonprofits and NGOs, advocacy groups, social impact organizations, government agencies, and municipalities. He has over 20 years in the data industry and has served as a subject matter expert for multiple Fortune 500 companies. So I'll turn it over to you, Josh.
Great, thanks. Let's see. There's a bunch of exclamation points on this menu, so we will see what happens. Oh, it is going to ask me to share my screen. Hopefully I won't lose that. Oh, I'll be right back because I did not give Zoom permission to share my screen. So I'll be back in about 10 seconds while Zoom resets.
I could tell somebody who just upgraded to Mac OS 16, I think. All the permissions get reset.
Great. Every single time I have to use a new chat program. One moment, let me now share my screen. There it is. So I will be walking through how I've been working with the Environmental Defense Fund to use open states, not just open states, but the rest of the open source internet that where we are tracking or collecting any organizations that are collecting or tracking information about politicians to understand at a state level and as granular as we can get from federal down to the local, who are the people, who are the organizations, that are influencing the decision makers, legislators, people in the executive, as they're going about making decisions, passing legislation, and just getting a all-around better understanding of what that landscape looks like, as broad of a casting as wide of a net as possible. A little bit about myself. So as was said in my introduction, about a year ago, I founded Open Lake Consulting. I've spent most of my career in the corporate sector, working for large corporations here. I'm based in Chicago. I realized after some time that a lot of the services that I was able to provide, that my teams were able to provide to these large corporations, were getting lost out, weren't being made accessible to organizations that, I mean, quite honestly, need it the most. Yes, corporations can use artificial intelligence, they can use data science, they can use all of these, like all of the buzzwords like big data and whatnot, to get really impressive results on the bottom line. But at the end of the day, the organizations that need it, the nonprofits, the social good organizations, municipalities who are trying to make their data more transparent, make sure that they're being held accountable, didn't have the resources to be able to implement those. And so that was really the inspiration behind Open Lake Consulting. That is how I ended up being connected to my colleague, Dr. Newton Campbell, who's located now out in Perth, Australia, and eventually led to this partnership with the Environmental Defense Fund. So I'll be walking through a little bit of the problem statement, give a very high level overview of how we're using open states. This is a project that's very much still in the research phase. We have a partnership with Georgia Tech, where we're having grad students help us develop scrapers, do research at a state-by-state level, to eventually get to an end result where an analyst at the Environmental Defense Fund would be able to get, before going into a meeting or before working on an initiative, being able to understand sort of the influential landscape that they're dealing with. So as I said, I was brought in by the Environmental Defense Fund. This project is spearheaded by 4 people, including myself, spread out across the globe. So the Environmental Defense Fund is located in Virginia. I'm here in Chicago. Dr. Newton Campbell is currently located in Australia. Before he left for a position there a couple of months ago, he was working with NASA as their chief of artificial intelligence, or their head of artificial intelligence. And then we have a business intelligence expert who is located in Denmark. And so over the course of the past year, we have been working to find ways that we could track political influence, first at the federal level, and then now starting to look at the state level. Alex talked a little bit about this. So at the federal level, you have 1 House and you have 1 Senate. As you go out into the different states, I was originally going to say that there are 50 houses and 50 Senates, but then I discovered Nebraska only has 1, and so I learned something new. And each one of these states has a different way of doing their data collection, how transparent they're going to be. Some states, some municipalities, Illinois is a good example. We actually make it very easy for people, or relatively easy when you compare it to some of the other options, to be able to get data on what's going through the legislation, who's voting on what, when it comes to financial disclosures, and being able to pull that in and analyze it. And even if another state was as equally transparent, the issue then ends up becoming, are they doing it in the exact same way? They're not. And so before we started to look at open states, we were thinking that we were going to have to go into every single state's database or web page and create a different tool to be able to get to this data. Now, we are still going to have to do that for all those pieces of data that Open States doesn't necessarily cover. But when it came to specifically what legislation was being passed, who was voting for it, who was co-sponsoring it, the fact that we had something like Open States where we could just go and get that in a unified format to be able then to merge it, match it up with other pieces of data saved us so much time. It allowed me and people on my team to be able to focus on the important stuff, which was actually trying to put it in a format where we could start to look and analyze at it, or look at and analyze the data. So at the top of the page, the challenge, the overarching challenge for the entire project is to be able to use natural language processing, to be able to graph the different politicians and different influencers into a large network, to understand not just who's influencing who. So not just pulling up a chart or a network graph where you have a politician in the center and then a bunch of people around it and say, these are the people who are influencing this person, but to be able to understand and explain the strength of that relationship, and also be able to understand the sourcing of it. So this is the piece where we really leaned in heavily into what Open States has to offer. So one thing that Open States really was really beneficial to us is the fact that we could write an API call for a given state, whether it's the House or the Senate of that state, and do a keyword search on either something like the environment, climate change, electric cars, anything that the Environmental Defense Fund might be interested in looking at. Finding anything that matched that, and then starting to see who sponsored it, who co-sponsored it, and then how people voted. And being able to do that for the entire legislation over a period of time, we could then start to map that out. So we could see, this is a sample, I made this up, where, but it does happen, especially as you get into local areas where you do start to see at a federal level where people would vote across party lines. When you start to get into more local jurisdictions, you start to see people who aren't necessarily just going to be more likely to cross party lines, at least in this day, at least right now. Who knows what will happen going forward? And that's where it really, that's where this focus comes in. It's finding those people who are willing to take action for focused more on the importance of what could be good for the community and not necessarily what they're being told to do by party leaders. Finding out how that works and potentially being able to influence that influencer so that the message could be able to flow through and potentially make change. Now, we could potentially do this one at a time or state by state, but the Environmental Defense Fund has offices all across the globe. We are focused on the United States, at least at this point. And so, yes, it would be nice to just say, okay, we want to look at Representative Smith. And then we go and we do some analytics on Representative Smith. And then we come back and we give them a presentation, a Tableau dashboard, and what have you. The main reasoning behind this, though, is to be able to do this at a scale large enough where we could really start to see from a statistical standpoint, things start to merge together. We can find those patterns, but also do it in a way where, one day the consultants will leave and then this tool will exist for the analysts at the EDF to be able to use. And so the important thing is to scale it. And so that's what we did. I did have to anonymize this, but this is a one specific look, a snapshot at various bills, the sponsors and the co-sponsors of various bills, and how that all funnels or radiates out from a particular politician that we're looking at, just understanding how that influence tracks. yes, this is messy. Eventually, we will be moving it over to being able to more easily be able to navigate and analyze, merging it in with other data. But that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to get as large a scale of data together so we can start to see these connections. And again, this is just open states. The real important piece that we're looking at is to understand what caused, or potentially to see not the deciding moment where somebody decided, you know what, there needs to be a bill about that gives, tax incentives when someone buys a Tesla. It's being able to just get an understanding of a given politician's current environment. And this is just one piece of it. So now where we are now, or what we're looking at doing and what we've begun to do, is sort of like Alex said, taking various other pieces of information, whether it's the Census Bureau, understanding a politician's jurisdiction. There are, the census has the business survey. So understanding what business interests are within a given state, a given district, understanding how many people are employed in that area, and have that be an understanding of potentially why a politician is being influenced to vote a certain way. It may not be that there's one particular person telling them to vote a certain way. There could be somebody who would say that I can or can't vote for this because my constituents would disagree with me. There's been talk about financial contributions from elections, so going to the FEC, also state by state, which is another issue that we always have to deal with. Every state has a different way where they aggregate their campaign donation disclosures. And so having to find ways to merge that in, but then that also gets added to the data set. And then right now, the big thing that we're trying to work on or understand is local press. Every politician has journalists that they prefer, or the ones that we've tracked, or that maybe some of them don't. And they have, they may have someone, an alert that pops up when their name gets mentioned. And so understanding who's writing about certain politicians, what those journalists are writing about, can help, again, just paint that picture and just understanding who or what is driving the decision making, or assisting in driving the decision making of a given politician. Once we do all of that, we have a Tableau installation and Neo4j. So for anyone not familiar with Neo4j, that's actually this. It's a database graph and a graphing engine where you can dump in millions of records and say this is how we would like to see them connected together. And then you can run data science and machine learning algorithms over top it to be able to start clustering and get a better understanding of how the data just generally fits together. So being able to take all of these different pieces of data and then say, what sort of categories are we seeing of these politicians? It's not just Democrats and Republicans. There are, a collection of politicians over here who tend to vote in the same sort of block on certain subjects, even though they may vote differently on other subjects. And so again, being able to give the analysts something that they could use where they could start to break apart all of this information and actually take action with it. Social media, understanding who they're talking to, who's talking to them, who they're following, any interactions that they have. And really starting to understand how a politician's influence changes over time. One issue that we've had when we've looked at pre-built software or offerings is that there are people at the Environmental Defense Fund who have actually worked in government, who have worked with some of the people, if not that politician, have actually worked with some of the people who are listed as influencers. And there was one instance where we saw someone who was listed as working on a state Supreme Court, like in someone's office, and someone said, oh no, they haven't worked there in years. And so it was because the data was really old. And actually, that reminds me, I didn't realize Google Civic API was so terrible, so I will stop telling people to use that. I don't use it, but I'll stop telling people to. But that's a perfect example where people assume that you have this information and that it's correct, but it decays over time. When you look at the federal level, one question we had right after the last election was, how do we deal with a situation like Joe Manchin? You know, if we're looking at political influence, his influence changed overnight. If we don't have a way to at least consider that, or to have some way of just tagging that moment in time, the entire system ends up losing a little bit of its reliability, which will make people not want to use it. And so how do we track that? Since we're dealing with people, since we're dealing with social interactions, it's very difficult to give a definitive answer on that. That's something that, again, working with a university to be able to have people start to really come through that, and working with experts who can work on that is something that I would say is one of the more important pieces of this larger project of really understanding just how this influence works. And with that, that's actually all I had. Let me stop sharing. And yeah, I'd love to take any questions that anyone might have. Let's see, are you using Elixir for developing your software? I'm actually using, I just use PyCharm. Everything that we're doing is in Python because I was hired as the developer, so that's what we do. But a lot of the work we do is, pinging APIs. We have talked to a couple of actual for-profit data collection companies to try and fill in some of those pieces, but it's the code development or the data collection is done in PyCharm, or so Python, and then we have a Snowflake database, and then obviously Neo4j and Tableau. Any other questions? If not, I am fine to hand it back over.
Well, it looks like the chat is clear. Any last questions for Josh? Well, Josh, thank you so much for presenting your work. It's really just, again, it's really cool to see how users are using OpenState's data. And then, yeah, just a thank you to everyone who presented today in this session. It's just really great to see kind of what the community is doing. And now we're going to switch over to our developer Q&A session that will start right after this.